In the icy winter of 1925, a woman of 80 slowly walked through the infinite corridors of Sandringham House, her footsteps echoing against cold marble as beats of an agonizing heart. The sound broke the morbid silence that had become his only faithful company, a denser silence than the air loaded with memories and regrets. Alexandra de Denmark, once queen of the world's greatest empire, dragged with her not only the weight of the years, but the invisible burden of 1,000 scores who once shaped her 21 waist, the narrowest in Victorian Europe, a measure that had become both her glory and her curse. The heavy carmesim velvet curtains remained hermetically closed, blocking any trace of winter light that insisted on penetrating the high and solemn windows. The whole house breathed a sepulchral atmosphere, where each room seemed suspended in time, preserving decades of performances and pretending. The air was impregnated with the ghostly aroma of accumulated dust, withered roses that no one else exchanged, and the visceral secrets kept for so many decades that had become part of the architecture. In her handy stand, she was holding a yellowish letter, never sent to a woman who had long died. Herself, the young Danish princess who had once dreamed of naively with something beyond the only possible destination. Calligraphy, once elegant and fluid, has now been trembling and desperate, each word a supplication directed to the past, a request for forgiveness to the girl she had systematically murdered in the name of aesthetic perfection. In the golden mirrors that ended the main corridor, ghostly reflexes of different times overlapped in spectral layers. The 18-year-old bride with her impossible waist and even living eyes of hope. The solemn queen crowned and wrapped in jewelry that weighed more than her own silenced voice. The mourned mother dressed in black perpetual deaths after the premature deaths of children who had barely known. And now, finally, this spectral figure that was all that was left of an obsessively dedicated aesthetic perfection as the only known form of survival in a world that saw it only as an ornament. Each mirror reflected not only an image, but a distinct time of refined suffering, of beauty built on foundations of physical and emotional pain. Golden frames framed decades of impeccable performances of calculated smiles, stressed postures to hide the constant agony of existing as a decorative object in perpetual display. The corridor extended infinitely, as if the architecture itself had curved to accommodate the vastness of its loneliness. If you are interested in stories about the hidden price of perfection and the devastating emotional cost of real glamour, subscribe to more narratives about figures that transform their own existence into art, even when this art has completely consumed them, leaving only beautiful wreckage where once a human soul existed. Alexandra Caroline Marie Charlotte. Louise Julia was born on December 1st, 1844, in the majestic Yellow Palace of Copenhagen, daughter of Christiano IX of Denmark, and Louise de Hesse Castle, at a time when the birth of a princess was simultaneously a political blessing and a death sentence for any dream of personal autonomy. Its entry into the world coincided precisely with the height of European Romanticism, when femininity was meticulously sculpted as a work of living art, delicate as porcelain, ornamental as a jewel, and eternally young as a doll that should never grow or question its decorative role. The Yellow Palace, with its golden walls and infinite halls, became the first laboratory where Alexandra would be transformed from a child into art object. From the early years of consciousness, she has been shaped with the surgical accuracy of a sculptor working marble, every aspect of her carefully pruned nascent personality to meet the expectations of a society that saw women as currencies of marriage exchange, valuable only as long as they kept their untouched beauty and their own completely annulled. His education was designed as a social engineering project. It did not include political literature that could arouse hazardous thoughts, a philosophy that could develop critical sense, or sciences that could expand its understanding of the world beyond the narrow limits of its ornamental function. Instead, the curriculum consisted only of French for surface conversations and halls, piano for male entertainment, aquarella to occupy empty hours with properly feminine activities, and above all, the supreme and cruel art of existing as a beautiful object without a voice of its own or inconvenient desires. At the age of 10, in an intimate ceremony that would be repeated daily for the next 70 years, Alexandra was introduced to the instrument that would define her existence, the children's corset. Made of soft but adamant leather, with whale fins imported especially from Greenland, Alexandra's first corset was adjusted by his mother, Louise, who considered this practice not only recommended, but absolutely essential for her daughter's future as a marriage currency in the European royal market. The process of placing the first corset was documented in intimate details in Louise's personal diary. The girl, Alexandra, still with the unconsciousness of childhood, cried during the first minutes of compression, her small hands trying to instinctively loosen the bonds that began to redefine the architecture of her body. Louise recorded with maternal satisfaction that, after 3 weeks of continuous use, her daughter had stopped complaining and learned to breathe more superficially, an adaptation she interpreted as a sign of educational progress. The Yellow Palace echoed daily with the sounds of this body education. The smooth grinding of the new leather against young ribs, the increasingly contained breaths, the metallic noise of the buckles being adjusted with millimeter accuracy. Alexandra learned early that her beauty was her only value coin in a world where women were evaluated as running horses, by the purity of lineage, the harmony of forms, and the ability to remain decorative without causing problems or expressing inconvenient opinions. Her golden brown hair, which naturally grew in rebellious curls, were tamed daily through a 2-hour routine that included meticulous brushing, application of oils imported from France, and modeling with heated irons that left discreet burns on her scalp. His hands never appeared unprotected, always remaining coat, even during meals, to maintain the aristocratic pallor that indicated a free life of manual labor. His posture was constantly corrected through metal rods strategically inserted into his corset, creating an artificial silhouette that would become his visual signature. The invention of photography came to Europe precisely when Alexandra entered the adolescence, and it would become one of the first real women to have its image reproduced in this new revolutionary technology. Each photo shoot was a carefully choreographed performance of calculated femininity, the modestly low look to suggest submission, the hands gently intertwined to hide any nervous tremor, the impossible waist that had become its visual trademark, each element positioned to create an image of female perfection that would be reproduced to the thousands and distributed throughout Europe as propaganda of Denmarkesa beauty. What carefully composite photographs could not capture was the soundtrack of this performance. The laborious sound of breathing hampered by constant compression, the purple and yellowish marks left systematically by the chit fins on his young skin, or the silent tears shed during the long melancholy stare which she was contemplated her reflection, and tried to recognize the girl who had one day that had been low of the doll in which he had transformed. This familiar obsession with physical perfection was not merely superficial vanity or aristocratic whim, it was war strategy applied to the female body. In the complex European marriage, chess game, where political alliances were sealed through arranged marriages, a beautiful princess represented the difference between survival and the destruction of small kingdoms such as Denmark. Alexandra needed to be physically impeccable, a masterpiece of artificial femininity, to properly fulfill her role of politically ensuring the survival of her homeland through a strategic marriage union. His waist of 21 inches, which would become legendary throughout Europe and would be commented obsessively from the international press, was not a genetic accident or result of good diet. It was artificially kept through specially made corsets that were used religiously for 18 hours a day, removed only for rapid baths and change of clothing, being immediately replaced by even more restrictive night versions that it wore even during sleep, turning every moment of existence into a continuous performance of forced beauty. In 1862, when Alexandra turned 18 and reached what was considered the peak of her manufactured beauty, she was formally offered to marriage to Prince Albert Edward de Wales, future Eduardo VII of England, in a political transaction disguised as a romance that would seal its destiny as a decorative object of the most powerful court in the world. The meeting of the two young people was meticulously choreographed as a romantic opera scene. He, the libertine heir to the most powerful throne on earth, it, arguably the most beautiful princess in Europe, a living doll specifically created for this moment of display. The union was publicly celebrated as a fairy tale came directly from children's storybooks, but Alexandra understood immediately, with the cruel clarity that only female youth can possess, that was being acquired as a decorative piece for the vast British royal collection, a human ornament designed to beautify official events while decoratedly silent on all real matters. The engagement period was a military preparation for a war she didn't know she was losing. For 6 months, Alexandra was undergoing a preparation regime that included intensive English label classes, additional modifications to her scores to achieve even more extreme measures, and training sessions to learn to feint gracefully if compression became unbearable during prolonged public events. She learned that fainting could be forgiven as female delicacy, but complaining of pain would never be tolerated as appropriate real behavior. The wedding ceremony, held at the majestic chapel of St. George on Windsor on March 10, 1863, was a calculated, magnificent show that cost the equivalent of current millions of pounds. Alexandra wore a white silk dress imported especially from France, with an 8-meter tail that required 6 ladies of honor to be carried properly, adorned with hand-made Honiton lace by dozens of artisans who worked for months, and diamonds personally borrowed by Queen Victoria, each stone representing the weight of expectations deposited over her young shoulders. His marriage butter, a body engineering masterpiece especially commissioned to the best artisans in Paris, is designed to reduce his waist to 19-inch personal record that required physical weekly preparation. The process of dressing it on the day of the ceremony was documented in shocking details by the ladies of honor. Alexandra was positioned between 2 marble columns, his hands firmly holding the structures, while 4 assistants simultaneously pulled the cords of the corset, each inch of additional compression drawing up moans that were carefully omitted from official reports. During the solemn ceremony, Alexandra could barely breathe, every inspiration being an epic battle against the fins that bought their internal organs hard enough to cause permanent damage. Each movement needed to be meticulously calculated in order not to break the bonds that kept it in the shape of a human hourglass. Each public gesture carefully rehearsed to hide the private agony that had become the constant soundtrack of its existence. The official wedding photographs, reproduced in newspapers throughout Europe, show a bride beating bride with supernatural beauty, but intimate witnesses later reported that she passed out 3 times during morning preparations and was revived through aromatic salts applied by discreetly positioned doctors. His pallor, interpreted romantically by the press as a virgin delicacy, was actually a result of oxygen deprivation caused by the extreme compression of his chest. The marriage officially marked the beginning of his new life as a living doll in the English court, but also the definitive end of any illusion about personal autonomy or marriage happiness. Albert Edward, widely known in aristocratic circles for his unbridled sexual veracity and open contempt for Victorian moral conventions, has publicly continued his extramarital relationships without making any effort to hide his infidelities, transforming Alexandra into a simultaneously decorative and melancholy figure, a public symbol of conjugal virtue, while being systematically humiliated in private. She quickly learned that her marriage role was to appear radiant at public events, posing for photographs that would be distributed as a propaganda of royal family harmony, while her husband openly betrayed her with deliberately chosen lovers because they were their full opposite. Voluptuous and spontaneous women who did not use scarce, who laughed too high, who expressed all that Alexandra had never been trained. The couple's first official photographs reveal the cruel disparity of their respective destinations. He, it seems, relaxed and confident with the natural stance of those born to command. She is eternally rigid as a statue, with her hands strategically positioned to hide the nerve tremors she had developed as a physical response to the constant stress of maintaining a performance of marital happiness that she knew to be an elaborate lie for public consumption. Its carefully built beauty had become a more effective golden prison than any cell, and each public appearance was a theatrical performance of marriage happiness that required emotional resources from it, while observing other women living with the freedom that had been denied to a waist of 19 inches and a real title that turned out to be increasingly empty of real meaning. Between 1864 and 1869, in a relentless succession that demonstrated its reproductive value to the crown, Alexandra gave birth to 6 children, transforming the most intimate and vulnerable experience of female existence into another scrutinized public performance arena obsessively by the European press. Each pregnancy was documented with the scientific accuracy of an experiment, with journalists speculating daily about whether it could keep its waist famous after births or finally succumb to the natural transformations of motherhood, thus losing its only recognized value in a society that saw women as disposable ornaments. What the consumer audience of these news could not imagine was that Alexandra wore maternity corsets specially designed by a consortium of doctors and engineers, pieces of torture disguised as lingerie that compressed their internal organs even more brutally during pregnancy. These diabolical instruments were designed to push the growing uterus up and inside, creating an optical illusion of unchanged waist, while causing excruciating pain and dangerously compromised oxygen supply to both the mother and the fetus. During his first pregnancy, carrying Albert Victor in 1864, Alexandra continued to fulfill all compulsory social commitments, appearing in public events with a seemingly unchanged silhouette that challenged the laws of human anatomy. This supernatural feat was possible through maternity scores that functioned as instruments of industrial compression applied to the human body, causing constant nausea, severe difficulty, and faint episodes that were discreetly treated as excessive female delicacy. The real doctors of the time, men trained in the best European universities, repeatedly warned about the medical risks of this practice, producing detailed reports on the dangers of compromising blood circulation during pregnancy. But Alexandra was psychologically convinced that losing her silhouette meant literally losing her right to existence, that her identity was so completely intertwined with her body measures that any physical change would be equivalent to a form of social death. Its maternity scores have been preserved in the actual archives and represent disturbing historical documents. Reinforced leather pieces with complex metal structures designed to redistribute the weight of a pregnancy so that it remained invisible when viewed frontally. The interior of these pieces was lined with silk to absorb sweat and blood that often resulted from extreme pressure against straight skin and displaced organs. Alexandra's births were traumatic events that went far beyond the physical pain inherent in the process. They were public humiliations orchestrated by a rarely present husband, preferring to spend these moments with his official lovers, and a press that speculated openly on his ability to recover the form after each birth, as if it were a manufactured product being tested for durability. The work of delivery of her first child lasted 16 hours, during which she kept a modified corset that allowed only minimal expansion. Medical witnesses reported that she spent more time worried about her appearance during contractions than with the birth process itself, repeatedly asking for mirrors to see if her posture remained dignified even during the most intense pain. Postpartum photographs were carefully staged within a week after each birth, showing a seemingly radiant mother with intact waist, but the reality behind these images was from a physically wretched woman fighting severe internal damage to meet unreal expectations over her body. She often developed postpartum infections due to compression that prevented proper blood circulation. But these medical problems were treated secret, not to not compromise your public image. Alexandra's relationship with her children was hopelessly harmed by this aesthetic obsession that consumed all her emotional and physical energy. She was so psychologically concerned with maintaining her appearance that she delegated all real maternal care to specialized nominations, appearing with her children only to meticulously planned official photographs or public events where she needed to perform the perfect mother's role for press consumption. Her children grew up seeing her mother as a simultaneously present and absent figure, physically close but emotionally unreachable, beautiful but untouchable as a museum artwork. They learned early that she was more symbol than a person, more performance than mother, a woman who had become so completely identified with her decorative function that she had lost her genuine human relationships. The birth of his youngest daughter, Maud, in 1869, officially marked the end of his reproductive phase and the beginning of an even more devastating new obsession: the desperate struggle to keep young forever through increasingly extreme methods. At the age of 25, Alexandra was already terrified of the inevitability of aging and began experimenting with experimental aesthetic treatments that included daily goat milk baths, facial masks made of human placenta, and the early invasive cosmetic procedures of modern medical history, turning her body into a laboratory for a lost war against time. In official assuming the title of Princess of Wales, Alexandra turned her quarters into Marlborough House into a dedicated sanctuary obsessively to her own image, creating what later historians would describe as the first modern narcissism laboratory in real history. Deus, each room of his residence was meticulously redesigned to function as a theater where he constantly performing a person's audience, herself, in an endless piece on the maintenance of beauty against the relentless forces of time and human nature. Full body mirrors, imported especially from Venice and framed in massive gold, were strategically positioned at scientifically calculated angles, allowing it to monitor its appearance under all possible angles simultaneously. There was not a single point in her rooms where she could escape her own infinitely multiplied image, creating a psychological effect of constant vigilance that turned every private moment into a public performance for a ghostly reflex audience. She has been religiously dedicated up to 6 hours a day to elaborate beauty rituals, in an obsessive routine that had become more important than eating, sleeping, or interacting with others. This vanity liturgy included multiple score exchanges throughout the day, each change requiring the presence of 4 assistants and lasting approximately 40 minutes, application of French creams made with secret ingredients that included mercury and other toxic elements, and massage sessions performed by experts hired specifically to maintain their blood circulation minimally despite constant compression that had made a second skin. Visitors from their quarters, including members of the royal family and foreign diplomats, described the environment as a temple to female vanity brought to the extreme pathological, but also as deeply melancholy and disturbing. Velvet curtains remained partially closed throughout the day to protect their skin from sunlight, which could cause premature spots or wrinkles, creating a perpetual twilight atmosphere that made their quarters seem suspended between day and night, between reality and dream, between life and death. The air of its rooms was always impregnated with a complex mixture of aromas. Fresh roses brought daily from the royal gardens, a fragrant talc applied obsessively to absorb any trace of human sweat, and the penetrating medicinal smell of the ointments that it applied religiously caused by scores, marks that never completely heal because they were renewed daily through the same compression that caused them. Alexandra developed a morning routine that invariably started at 5 in the morning with the meticulous application of a face mask made of egg whites with macerated rose petals, a treatment that lasted exactly 1 hour as long as it remained immovable as a statue not to break the mixture. At 6 at point, their personal maidens, women selected by their absolute discretion and trained in refined torture techniques, helped her to wear the first scatter. The day of the day, a piece of treated leather and steel that reduced its waist to 20-inch for the morning activities considered less formal. At noon, following a schedule as accurate as the operation of a Swiss clock, it performed the first formal corset exchange, replacing the morning version with an even tighter and ornate model, only inch, specifically used during meals to maintain the optical illusion of which it normally, when in fact its digestive capacity had been so composed by constant compression that it could barely ingest liquid foods, surviving basically through nutritious broths and toning medications. The mirrors of their quarters functioned like windows for multiple temporal dimensions, reflecting not only their current image, but evoking all the previous versions of itself. The still, innocent Danish princess, the radiant but terrified bride, the absent but photographically present mother, the betrayed but publicly smiling wife. Each reflex contained layers of meaning and memory, transforming the simple action of looking into the mirror into an archaeological experience of excavating lost identities. Intimate letters, discovered decades later, reveal that Alexandra had developed the disturbing habit of speaking to her own reflection, keeping elaborate and intimate conversations with her image as if she were a separate and distinct person. She began to refer to the woman in the mirror as she, developing complex emotional relationships with different versions of herself, reflected in mirrors positioned at specific angles that create subtle optical illusions. This phase of your life marks the clinical onset of a disorder that we would now recognize as severe body dysmorphism, combined with obsessive-compulsive behavior. Alexandra began to realize completely non-existent defects in her appearance, developing fixations and imaginary imperfections that no one else could see, and creating compulsive rituals of mirror verification that could last hours and left her emotionally exhausted. Medical documents preserved in the real archives record that she even changed corset 12 times a day, always looking for a larger compression, a narrower waist, a more perfect silhouette that existed only in her tortured imagination. Each exchange was accompanied by obsessive measurements with metric tapes imported especially from Paris with millimeter accuracy, creating a detailed database of their own body measurements that would become one of the most accurate documentation about body dysmorphism in medical history. In 1901, with the solemn death of Queen Victoria, Alexandra finally risen to the title she had expected for 4 decades, becoming queen consort to 56 years in a ceremony that should represent the triumphant apex of her trajectory, but which turned out, with the poetic cruelty reserved for historical ironies, the beginning of her deepest and irreversible existential loneliness. Eduardo VII, now king crowned with the world's largest empire, not only publicly maintained his extramarital relationships, but has made his connection with Alice Keppel, definitely relegating Alexandra to a purely ceremonial and decorative role. During the elaborate coronation ceremony at Westminster's majestic abbey, assisted by representatives of all European royal houses, Alexandra used a corset specially made by a team of artisans who worked for 6 months to create a piece that could reduce her ripe waist, already naturally expanded by age and multiple pregnancies, 22 inches, one deed that their personal doctors considered not only dangerous but medically impossible without lethal risks. The physical exertion needed to maintain this compression during a ceremony that lasted more than 4 hours was so brutal that it passed out twice during preliminary trials and needed to be discreetly charged by auxiliaries to a private room where it was revived through pure oxygen administered by discreet masks. Real doctors threatened to renounce collectively if she insisted on using the ceremonial corset, but Alexandra replied that she would rather die during the coronation to appear publicly with an imperfect silhouette. The official photographs of the coronation, reproduced in newspapers throughout the British Empire, show a queen of impressive majesty and supernatural beauty that challenge scientific explanations about the aging process. But confidential medical reports, discovered a century later, reveal that she suffered multiple costal fractures due to the extreme pressure of the ceremonial score, damage that was secretly treated during without honest not to compromise your public image of unshakable perfection. As a crowned queen, Alexandra discovered with growing horror that her voice had definitely and irrevocably silenced by the system that had elevated her to the top of the social hierarchy. His political opinions were not requested or tolerated. His public appearances were choreographed until the last gesture by centenary protocols that did not admit human improvisation, and his official function was cruelly to exist as a decorative symbol of the royal majesty, a living statue that had never permitted to question or deeply understand. During this period of crowned solitude, Alexandra began to develop a progressive deafness that her doctors initially considered psychosomatic, an unconscious form of her body rejecting a world where she was not allowed to speak, a sensory withdrawal of a reality that had become unbearable. Deafness selectively manifested. It perfectly heard the whispered criticism of its appearance, but it developed a mysterious disability of processing conversations about politics, economics, or any subject that could arouse inconvenient opinions. Alexandra's official portraits as queen document a disturbing psychological transformation. Her eyes, once vivid and expressive even in embarrassed youth, have acquired a vitreous and distant quality that photographers of the time described as the look of those who see through the world towards something that no longer exists. Her skin, kept artificially young through increasingly aggressive cosmetic treatments that included experimental paraffin injections and radium's applications, began to have a serosa pallor that gave her a ghostly look, even in daylight. The real smile, always perfectly positioned for cameras through decades of training, suffered a sinister metamorphosis. It was still technically impeccable, but no longer reached their eyes, creating an expression that contemporary observers described as beautifully disturbed, like a well-conserved corpse smiling at eternity. The smile had become so automatic that she kept him even when she believed she was alone, a permanent face mask that had merged with her real identity. During this period of ghostly reign, Alexandra developed the compulsive habit of writing letters addressed to herself, not to the queen she had become, but to the young Danish princess she vaguely remembered before the first transformation. These letters, discovered decades later in secret compartments in his desk, reveal a completely fragmented woman, unable to reconcile the person who could have been with the decorative figure in which he had become decades of systematic self, beauty disguised as beauty. A particularly devastating passage, written with trembling handwriting during a winter insone, says, "Dear Copenhagen girl, forgive me for murdering your dreams in the name of beauty. I didn't know that the price would be my soul, my voice, my ability to feel something beyond the constant pain that became my more faithful companion. They only exist to be contemplated by eyes that never summer them as human." Other letters reveal elaborate fantasies, where she imagined conversations with the girl she had been, asking advice on decisions she had taken decades earlier, begging forgiveness for choices that had not really done, but had been imposed on her by a society that saw her only as a raw material to sculpt an ideal of impossible femininity. She wrote about recurring dreams where she found her youth walking through the Copenhagen gardens, and tried to warn her about the future that awaited her. But the girl could never hear her, as if she were already a ghost even in her own dreams. The death of Eduardo VII in 1910 brought to Alexandra a paradoxical form of relief that she would never be able to confess publicly. For the first time in almost 50 years of marriage, she was finally free from the systematic humiliations imposed by her husband's spectacular infidelities, but discovered with existential terror that her identity was so completely intertwined with the role of decorative and betrayed wife, who was no longer known to the family pain betrayal as a constant. Company. Victorian mourning, with its elaborate rules and coded performances, offered Alexandra a new form of existential theater, the perfect widow. She adopted black as an exclusive color not only of her clothes, but of her own identity, becoming a spectral figure that walked through the Palais Real CIOs as an elegant appearance, but obsessively maintained the narrow waist fixation even under the heavy mourning costumes that should theoretically offer some relief of decades of compression. Her widow beards, ordered especially for this new role, were made of revolutionary technical tissue that efficiently absorbed sweat and tears, because she found that crying had become a constant body function, such as breathing or blinking, an automatic response to a pain that had become so integral to her existence that she could no longer identify her specific origin. Tears flowed continuously but silently, without altering their carefully maintained facial expression. During the elaborate state funerals, which lasted a whole week and included representatives of all European royal houses, Alexandra almost fainted again, due to the combined pressure of the mourning corset and the weight of ceremonial costumes that included meters of black tissue and heavy jewelry that symbolized the magnitude of their official loss. But the photographs of the time show a widow of supernatural dignity, with such an erect and majestic stance that he completely hid the fact that she could barely breathe or remain conscious. Her performance as an inconsolable widow was so convincing that she discovered a strange and disturbing satisfaction in being considered the most elegant and moving widow in Europe. The pain had become her last art form, and she performed her with the same technical accuracy she had applied to the maintenance of her beauty for decades. Each public appearance was choreographed to maximize the emotional impact of its bereaved figure, every gesture studied to evoke sympathy and admiration for its dignity and suffering. The years of widowhood were marked by a geometrically growing isolation, such as concentric circles of loneliness that expanded to swallow all its existence. Alexandra resided almost exclusively on Sandringham, turning the property into a personal mausoleum where she could finally remove the happiness mask she had worn for decades, discovering horrified that there was nothing more under her. The mask had permanently merged with her face. His widow quarters were reorganized as a museum dedicated to his own existence. Walls covered with portraits of herself at different times, each image representing a distinct version of the woman who had been. She has developed the psychologically disturbing habit of using different scores to represent every decade she had lived, alternating between them as a who-flip into a physical memoir, but made of pain and leather instead of paper and paint. A few days, she woke up deciding to be 18-year-old Danish princess, wearing the corset that reproduced the measures of her youth, and spending all day talking to old portraits as if they were people present. Other days, she chose to be the crowned queen, assuming the posture and facial expression she had performed during official events, but now for an audience of mirrors and photographs that could not applaud or criticize. During this period of accelerated fragmentation, Alexandra began to manifest behaviors that we would now reconceive as clear signs of early dementia, aggravated by decades of physical and emotional trauma, but at the time were discreetly interpreted by the few people who still visited her as understandable eccentricities of beloved royalty. She talked at length with old photographs of herself, asking for the young Danish princess advice on how to proceed in everyday situations, creating dialogues made between different versions of her own identity. His perception of reality definitely fragmented between multiple temporal personas, each physically represented by a specific corset that evoked body memories of different eras of suffering. She could spend a morning like the terrified bride of 1863, an afternoon like the absent mother of the 1870s, and a night like the 20th century silenced queen, not only changing clothes, but an entire identity, but an actress playing multiple roles in a play that never ended. In the last 15 years of her life, Alexandra has developed an obsession that transcended any previous compulsive behavior. She became a systematic collector of objects related to her own image, creating a physical archive of her existence that functioned simultaneously as a museum, mausoleum, and scientific laboratory, dedicated to the study of her own objectification. She ordered hundreds of additional portraits, marble busts and bronze representing different times of her beauty, porcelain dolls dressed just like her on specific occasions, and more than 1,000 corsets, literally one for each day significant from your adult life. His residence in Sandringham became a claustrophobic maze dedicated exclusively to the contemplation of his own existence, multiplied infinitely through objects that captured different aspects of his fragmented identity. Whole corridors were converted into galleries, where their own images repeated obsessively, creating a timely mirror chamber effect where present, past, and future were confused in a visual symphony of pathological narcissism. Each corset in its collection was catalogued with scientific archive accuracy. The exact date when it was first used, the specific occasion that motivated its making, the accurate waist measures on that particular day, detailed records about its physical and emotional condition during use, and even notes on climate phenomena and contemporary political events, as if it were documenting not only its own physical transformation, but creating a chronology alternative of European history measured in centimeters of compressed waste. This obsessive file represented more than vanity. It was a desperate attempt to scientifically understand its own objectification, to document academic accuracy, the process through which a human person had been systematically transformed into a representation of artificial femininity. She created detailed maps of her own destruction, graphs that showed the correlation between physical compression and psychological fragmentation, tables that related body measurements with specific traumatic events. The maidens that still served it, old women who had dedicated decades to maintaining their appearance, reported increasingly disturbing behaviors that suggested a completely disconnected psyche from consensual reality. Alexandra had begun to talk to her corsets as if they were distinct people, attributing complex personalities and elaborate stories to each specific model, creating intimate emotional relationships with objects that represented different aspects of their lost identity. The bride's corset had become Maria, the naive dreamer who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The coronation corset was Victoria, the majestic who carried the weight of the empire on his shoulders, but had lost the ability to feel genuine joy. Motherhood's corsets were collectively the suffering, a choir of voices that constantly lamented for the children she had generated, but had never been able to know intimately due to her obsession with her own appearance. She has developed elaborate rituals of conversation with these personal objects, establishing specific times to visit each, treating her own collection as a city inhabited by alternative versions of themselves who needed regular social attention. Occasional visitors, distant members of the royal family who were still fulfilling courtesy protocols, reported finding her excitedly speaking with chairs arranged scores, as if organizing a party where all the guests were different versions of it. During this final period of accelerated disintegration, Alexandra also began writing her memories in a completely unconventional way. Each chapter was written as she used a different corset, as if each physical version of herself had a distinct story and a unique perspective on the events they had shared. The manuscripts, discovered decades after their death, reveal a fragmented narrative where the same experience is described from multiple perspectives, each influenced by the specific compression it experienced during writing. The chapter on your marriage, written using the bride's score, is a romantic and optimistic narrative that completely ignores later humiliations. The same event, described using a widow butter, becomes a gothic tragedy full of sinister omens. This involuntary literary technique has created a unique document in the autobiographical literature, a life told through multiple body identities, each physically preserved through instruments of torture that had molded not only his body but his own ability to perceive and memory. The correspondence of this time shows a woman completely disconnected from the 20th century, who continued to refer to people killed for decades as if they were still alive and active in their social life. She wrote letters to Queen Victoria, requesting advice on domestic issues, and awaited answers that obviously never arrived. She planned social events for people who had died, told you to make clothes for occasions that existed only in her fragmented memory, and kept imaginary telephone conversations with more J.O. versions come from itself. His only constant in this parallel universe of multiple identities was the daily routine of changing scarce, a ritual that had become more important than eating, sleeping, or any other basic body function. The ceremony of physical transformation had become its only connection with consensual reality, the only activity that still required interaction with other real people, the maidens that helped them dress and discharge the instruments that defined their existence. In November 1925, for 80 years, and healthily compromised by decades of systematic self-mutilation, Alexandra made a decision that surprised even the few people who still accompanied her deterioration. She would make a last public appearance during the solemn celebrations of the World War I, an event that would mark not only the official end of the Great War, but also her own final farewell of a world she had never fully understood. For this ultimate occasion, she had a corset that would represent the impossible synthesis of all her existence, a unique piece that combined aesthetic and structural elements of all significant corsets of her life, creating a kind of wearing autobiography that told the story of 70 years of compression through technical details that only completely decipher. The project demanded the collaboration of expert artisans who worked for 6 months to create something that challenged both engineering and human anatomy. Preparation for this final event has become an epic production that lasted 3 full days, involving a discreetly positioned emergency medical team, specialists in Paris specifically brought from this occasion, and a safety protocol that included pure oxygen supply if it lost consciousness during the clothing process. Alexandra categorically insisted on using the tighter corset of her entire historical collection, reducing her octogenarian waist, already naturally expanded by age and deformed by decades of compression, to 23 exact inches, just 2 more than in her distant youth. This achievement, which their personal doctors considered not only dangerous but literally impossible without immediate lethal consequences, required a technique developed specifically for the occasion. 4 specialized assistants working simultaneously in 15-minute shifts with regular breaks for her to recover consciousness when she passed out oxygen deprivation. The complete process of dressing it lasted almost 4 hours, during which she lost and recovered her consciousness 17 times but maintained an unshakable determination to achieve the measures she had set as an ultimate goal. During the solemn ceremony, which brought together representatives of all European royal houses in a post-war state demonstration, Alexandra remained completely still as a marble statue, her face covered by a black mourning veil that hid not only the constant tears that became her permanent facial expression, but also the physical marks of extreme suffering that her last performance was causing. Contemporary witnesses reported that it did not comment a single word throughout the event, communicating exclusively through imperceptible head gestures and almost microscopic eyes of the eyes. The official photographs of this last appearance, which became iconic in the post-war period documentation, show a spectral figure of supernatural beauty and disturbing majesty, more reminiscent of an elegant appearance than of an octogenarian flesh and bone woman. Her silhouette challenged all the known laws of geriatric anatomy, creating an optical illusion that made her seem to have stopped in time around 40, but with eyes that carried the cruel wisdom of those who had seen too much and felt beyond the limits of human resistance. Immediately after the event, Alexandra was discreetly transported back to Sandringham in an almost military operation that included medicals specializing in trauma, assisted breathing equipment, and absolute silence about her real condition. She had managed to perform her final performance, but the physical cost was devastating. Multiple costal fractures, internal bleeding, and a general collapse of body systems that had been forced beyond their absolute boundaries for decades. After this event, which she described in her diary as my last love letter for beauty, Alexandra permanently gathered in her quarters, firing most of the employees who still kept, and keeping only 2 octogenarian maidens, who had dedicated their own lives to the care of their apparence thee. These women, who knew her more intimately than any member of her family, became the only witnesses of her last rituals of transformation. Her last weeks were dedicated to a macabre project she called the Great Recap. She wore a different corset every day, reliving chronologically every significant phase of her adult life, from the young Danish princess to the bereaved widow. Each identity required not only a specific corset, but a complete transformation of personality, voice, gestures, and even breathing patterns that had characterized different times of their existence. The final records, maintained by the maiden that became involuntarily historians of their final disintegration, describe a woman who had completely transcended the boundaries between performance and reality. She was no longer interpreting versions of herself. She had become a theatrical machine that automatically produced different female identities, each perfectly performed but completely disconnected from any recognizable personal core. Alexandra woke up at 5 in the morning as the Danish princess of 1844, had breakfast as the 1863 bride, had lunch like the mother of the 1870s, had dinner like the queen of the 1900s, and was going to sleep as the 1910 bezetted widow. Each transformation was accompanied by the exchange of the corresponding scorer, creating a daily cycle of death and rebirth, that had become more real for her than any real for her another aspect of contemporary existence. Alexandra died silently on November 20th, 1925, alone in her quarters in Sandringham House, on a winter morning when the property silence was denser than usual, as if nature itself was paying a final tribute to a woman who had turned suffering into a refined art form. She was found by one of her centuries, old maidens wearing the bride's corset, exactly the same model used during her marriage in 1863, in a final attempt to return to the only version of herself who still considered genuinely hopeful and human. The scene of his death was preserved in intimate detail by the official reports. She was positioned in her bed as if she was only sleeping, her hands carefully intertwined over her chest in the same position she had learned to maintain during 70 cameras years earlier. Her face, despite her advanced age, kept an expression of serenity she had never been able to achieve in life, as if death had finally allowed her to relax facial muscles that had remained tense for decades of continuous performance. The autopsy, performed discreetly so as not to compromise the official image of his peaceful death, revealed physical damage that even shocked doctors used to examine bodies traumatized by war. Its ribs had been permanently deformed by continuous compression, creating a completely unnatural thoracic box that resembled an abstract sculpture than a human anatomical structure. Its internal organs were displaced from their original positions, compressed in inadequate spaces, functioning by pure biological determination against all medical probabilities. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a complete dermal map of his life. Deep and permanent marks on his skin formed complex geometric patterns that told the detailed story of each corset it had used. These scars, invisible when she was dressed but clearly defined in her naked body, created a kind of involuntary tattoo that documenting 70 years of systematic body modification, turning her own skin into a physical file of her refined self, mutilation. His room was found in a state that surprised even family members who were used to their final eccentricities. More than 1,000 scores were meticulously organized in chronological order around their bed, each accompanied by a small silver plate recorded with specific dates, exact measurements, and personal notes on significant events associated with the use of each piece. It was as if she had created a circular museum of her own objectification, documenting with scientific accuracy her gradual transformation of person into a symbol. Among her most intimate personal belongings, she was discovered a diary that she had secretly kept during the last 40 years of her life, where she obsessively recorded the exact measurements of her waist every day, creating a detailed chart that showed minimal fluctuations, rarely more than half-inch, highlighting the absolute control she had kept over her own body, even during the final decades when the normal nature and would have resumed control over body form. The last entrances of this diary, written with increasingly trembling but still readable handwriting, obsessively repeated the same phrase as a desperate mantra. I'm still beautiful. I'm still beautiful. I'm still beautiful. I'm still beautiful. Words occupied whole pages, written hundreds of times with the insistence of those who tried to convince the world, but to herself, of a truth that had become her only reason to exist, even when existence had become indistinguishable from torture. Alexandra's funeral was a traditionally majestic, real pomp event, with representatives of all European houses paying a final honor to the woman who had defined the feminine beauty standards of an entire era. But the cruel irony was that few of those present really knew her as an individual person. They were burying a symbol. An idealized representation of Victorian femininity led to their extreme logical consequences. But the royal woman Alexandra could have been died decades earlier, gradually suffocated by the same spars that made her famous. During the funeral ceremony, when her coffin was definitely sealed, one of the century's old maidens who had faithfully served her a phrase that became the unofficial epitaph of her existence. Finally, she can breathe. This simple observation contained the whole tragedy of a lifetime, dedicated to the systematic denial of the most basic needs of the human body in the name of an aesthetic ideal that had completely consumed its ability to experience any form of pleasure or genuine satisfaction. Its 1,000 scores were discreetly destroyed after the funeral, burned in a private fire that lasted 3 days and nights, as if the royal family wanted to definitely erase the physical evidence of their systematic destruction. But the ashes of this burning were secretly preserved and buried in an unmarked ballot box in the Sandringham Gardens, creating a silent memorial for the instruments that had defined their existence more completely than any real title or political conquest. Today, when we observe the carefully preserved photographs of Alexandra de Denmark, we see reflected the dark mirror of aesthetic obsessions that continue to echo in our contemporary time, revealing that their history is not just a historical document about Victorians' excesses, but a prophetic omen of ways as women are still encouraged to transform their own bodies into battlefields against human nature. His 20-inch waist was not just a curious physical measure, it was the cruel metric of a society that had discovered how to turn women into decorative objects through the systematic application of physical pain, disguised as a ritual of beauty. Alexandra's devastating history acts as the dark mirror of all women who have learned to exist primarily as visual performances, who found that their only social value coin was in the ability to systematically deny their own humanity in exchange for approval based exclusively on artificially modified physical appearance. The Thousand Scores are direct ancestors of all contemporary forms of female compression, physical, emotional, psychological, and intellectual, that still define the narrow boundaries that a woman can be and express in exchange for social acceptance and male love. In his final days, whispering intimate conversations for ancient photographs of herself and keeping dialogues elaborated with younger versions preserved only in images, Alexandra had become the perfect incarnation of femininity that systematically devours the carrier itself. She has managed to keep her waist famous until 80 years through superhuman determination, but has completely lost her soul in the process. A sacrifice that still resonates in the mirrors of millions of contemporary women who have learned to see each other exclusively through the eyes of others, internalizing beauty patterns that require the constant denial of their authentic needs and desires. The ghostly sound of their scores being tightened each morning echoes today in the gyms, aesthetic clinics, and rooms where women prepare daily to be seen. Each historic medal fins a musical note in the cruel symphony of a beauty that voraciously feeds on female suffering systematically transformed into a public spectacle. Alexandra de Denmark was not just a queen who used 1,000 scores during her existence. She was the tragic and prophetic prototype of all women who discovered too late that, at the altar of aesthetic perfection, what is first and irreversibly sacrifices itself, and is always the ability to exist as being human, the complete. Their corsets, burned in secret after their death, left ashes that still contaminate the soil where they were buried, as if the earth itself kept memory of the pain they represented. Each woman who looks in the mirror today and seeing only defects to be corrected is unconsciously placing one of Alexandra's ghost scores, squeezing not only the waist but the soul, until breathing becomes an act of resistance against his own existence. Alexandra's true tragedy was not to have died at the age of 80. It was to have died 18 as he put on his first adult corset and accepted that his humanity was an acceptable price to pay for the promise of being eternally beautiful. All that came later were only 62 years of a magnificently preserved corpse by performing a femininity performance to an audience that never saw her as a person. What remains from Alexandra de Denmark is not her royal titles or historical appearances, but the eternal whisper of her last written words. I'm still beautiful. I'm beautiful. I'm still beautiful. A phrase that continues to be repeated in millions of mirrors around the world by women who have learned that beauty is a golden prison from which it has never lived, only slowly died, an inch of waste at a time, until there is nothing but a perfect silhouette involving an absolute emptiness where there was once a human soul.